AJ Key Story Ek Ace Peaceful Shurat Se Star Hodi High, Joe Dear Drama Mi Badalti High, Ek Woman Apni Garden KO Surf Shock, or Sakun Kalia Banati High, Uski AS Pos Neighbors Uski Kubsurdi, Se Kush Hone, Kubajay Jealous Feel Cardi Hane, Ubi Sab Kut Shiant Lag Raha High, Lekanya Shanti Zayada Dintak Chown Wali Nahi High. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where lawns looked identical, driveways were spotless, and the mailboxes all stood like little soldiers in a neat row. Families waved to each other on weekends, and kids rode their bikes in circles around the cul-de-sac. From the outside, everything seemed picture perfect. At the corner house, however, there was something different. A small garden stretched across the front yard, vibrant with colors that caught the eye of anyone who passed by. Tulips, roses, and sunflowers bloomed in harmony, as though nature itself had decided to break the monotony of trimmed grass and cookie-cutter hedges. And right in the middle of it all was a woman, crouched down with a small trowel in her hand, humming softly as she loosened the soil. Her name was Elena, a woman in her 30s who had recently moved into the neighborhood. Unlike most of the residents, who spent their free time at HOA meetings or discussing property values, Elena found joy in tending to her plants. For her, the garden was not just a hobby, it was a sanctuary. Every flower she planted told a story. Every patch of soil carried her care, and every blossom was a reminder of the peace she craved after years of living in a noisy city apartment. Each morning, before the neighborhood truly woke up, Elena would step outside with her gloves on and a cup of tea balanced on the fence. She would kneel down, gently water the roots, and whisper little words of encouragement to her plants, something she had picked up from her grandmother. Plants feel love too, her grandmother had once told her, and Elena had never forgotten it. The neighbors noticed her dedication. Some smiled politely as they walked by, while others slowed down their cars just to glance at the bright garden bursting with colors. To Elena, these looks felt harmless, almost admiring. But what she didn't realize was that admiration had already begun to turn into envy. For the Johnsons, who lived next door, Elena's garden was a constant reminder that their own front yard looked dull and lifeless. Mrs. Johnson, in particular, hated the fact that passers-by often stopped to take pictures of the flowers. "This isn't a botanical garden," she muttered one afternoon as she peeked through her blinds. Across the street, Mr. Sanders complained that Elena's sunflowers were too tall and blocked his view of the cul-de-sac. Another neighbor whispered to her husband, "She's new here, but already acting like this is her personal paradise." These whispers, at first scattered, soon began to grow louder in living rooms and backyard barbecues. What should have been a small source of joy for the community started to feel like a disruption to those who couldn't bear the idea of someone else's success, or, in this case, someone else's flowers outshining their own. But Elena remained unaware of the brewing tension. For her, life was simple. Water the plants, prune the roses, and smile at anyone who passed by. She had no idea that her little paradise had become the center of silent debates. One Saturday morning, she placed a fresh bird feeder near the garden. The sound of sparrows chirping filled the air, and she leaned back in her chair with satisfaction. This is how life should be, she thought. Peaceful, simple, and free of unnecessary complications. What she didn't notice, however, was that behind the curtains of several houses, eyes were watching, some with curiosity, some with irritation. To them, Elena's peace was not their peace. And soon, their quiet disapproval would start to take shape into something more tangible. By the end of that week, Elena received her first odd encounter. A neighbor, Mrs. Collins, stopped by and remarked, "Lovely garden, but don't you think it's a bit much of a neighborhood?" Her smile was polite, but her tone carried a hint of judgment. Elena laughed it off, thinking it was just casual small talk. Little did she know, this was the first of many comments, each carrying an unspoken message. You don't belong here the way you think you do. For now, though, the sun was shining, the garden was alive, and Elena still believed she had found her peaceful haven. But peace, as the neighborhood was about to prove, was temporary. The first time Elena felt something unusual was at the grocery store a week later. She had gone out to pick up fertilizer and some fresh soil, and as she walked through the aisles, she noticed two women from her neighborhood. Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Collins, standing near the checkout line. They were whispering to each other, their eyes darting toward Elena more than once. As soon as she walked past them, the conversation stopped. Their stiff smiles told her everything she needed to know. Whatever they were talking about, it had to do with her. Elena brushed it off at first. Maybe it was her imagination, she thought, but the feeling lingered by the following weekend. Gossip had taken deeper roots. At the neighborhood barbecue, whispers floated like smoke over the grill. One man muttered, "That garden is going to bring down property values. This isn't some countryside farm." Another replied, "HOA won't let that go on for long." Elena, who had come to the event with a homemade pie, noticed how the conversation seemed to shift whenever she walked close. Smiles became tight, and laughter turned forced. The same people who once waved cheerfully from their driveways were now exchanging silent glances behind her back. It wasn't just the beauty of her garden anymore. It had become a symbol. To some, it was rebellion. To others, it was arrogance. And to the HOA, it was potential rule-breaking. The homeowners association in this neighborhood wasn't just strict. It was notorious. Every resident received a thick handbook when they moved in, filled with pages of regulations. The exact height of fences, the approved shades of paint for our houses, even how long a trash can stay at the curb. On paper, the rules were designed to maintain order and preserve community standards. But in practice, they gave power to those who loved control. And in this community, a few individuals loved it more than anything. The handbook had one particular clause that soon became the subject of heated discussion. Front yards must be kept uniform, with grass maintained at a height not exceeding 3 inches. Addition structures or alterations must be approved by the HOA board. For years, this rule had been used to reject everything from swing sets to bird baths. Elena's garden, with its bright colors and towering sunflowers, was seen as a direct violation, at least by those who wanted to see it that way. It started small. Mrs. Johnson mentioned to a group of neighbors, "It's not that I hate flowers, but there are rules. If everyone started doing what she's doing, this place would look chaotic." Mr. Sanders added, "Exactly. Next thing you know, people will be growing corn in their front yard." The comments drew chuckles, but underneath the humor was an edge of seriousness. The idea that Elena's garden might spread, might encourage others to step outside the rigid lines, unsettled them. The HOA thrived on uniformity, and Elena's creativity was threatening that fragile balance point one evening. Elena was watering her roses when she heard voices from across the street. The Sanders family was sitting on their porch. She caught fragments of their conversation carried by the breeze. HOA should do something, can't just let it slide. Elena froze for a moment, then went back to her work, pretending not to hear. But inside, her stomach tightened. The peaceful ignorance she had once lived in was slipping away a few days later. The HOA held its monthly board meeting in the community center. Elena didn't usually attend these gatherings. She preferred spending that time in her garden. But this time, her absence was noted. Inside the meeting room, the atmosphere buzzed with discontent. "We need to address the situation at the corner house," Mrs. Johnson declared, tapping her pen against the table. "It's an eyesore, against the rules." Some nodded, others hesitated. A few board members questioned whether the garden was truly a violation. But voices like Mrs. Johnson's were louder, and in such meetings, volume often translated into power. By the end of the night, no formal decision was made, but the seed had been planted. The HOA would be keeping a closer eye on Elena. Within days of the HOA meeting, whispers transformed into direct complaints. Elena began receiving strange looks whenever she worked in her garden. Children who once waved at her on their bikes now hurried past, warned by their parents not to linger too long near her yard. One morning, she found a neatly folded piece of paper tucked under her doormat. It wasn't signed, but the message was clear. "This isn't a farm. Your garden doesn't fit in here. Please consider removing it before the HOA gets involved." Elena stared at the note for a long time. Her first instinct was to laugh it off. Surely it was just one unhappy neighbor venting. But something about the careful wording unsettled her. It didn't feel like the voice of just one person. It felt collective. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the plotting grew bolder. Mrs. Collins invited a few neighbors for tea, and the garden was the centerpiece of their discussion. She seems nice enough, but rules are rules, one guest said. Exactly, Mrs. Collins replied. If she gets away with this, what stops others from doing the same? Next thing you know, we'll lose the uniform look of the community. And if property values drop, the room hummed with nods and agreements. Fear of change, more than the garden itself, was fueling their frustration. The problem wasn't just Elena's flowers. It was the idea that she represented freedom in a place built on conformity. Soon, HOA board members began making casual drives past Elena's house. Sometimes they slowed their cars down, peering at the height of her sunflowers or the placement of her decorative stones. One even stopped while Elena was outside. You know, he said in a rehearsed, polite tone, front yards are supposed to maintain uniformity. Yours, well, it stand out quite a bit. Elena, trying to stay calm, replied, standing out isn't against the rules, is it? The man smiled thinly. Not yet. Then he got back into his car and drove away. That short exchange lingered in Elena's mind. Not yet. It was both a warning and a promise. By mid-month, Elena felt a shift in the air. Neighbors who once stopped for small talk now avoided eye contact. Invitations to gatherings stopped arriving. Even casual conversations at the mailbox felt colder, clipped. Her garden, which had once brought her joy and connection, now seemed to create distance between her and everyone else. She began questioning herself late at night. Was I wrong to plan it? Should I have asked for permission? Am I really disturbing anyone? But each morning, as the sunlight hit the blossoms and the scent of roses filled the air, she reminded herself why she had done it in the first place. This is my peace, my space, my right. 2 weeks after the HOA meeting, Elena received a letter in the mail with the HOA's official letterhead. The words were wrapped in legal language, but the message was unmistakable. Your yard has been found to be in potential violation of community guidelines. Please be prepared for an inspection within the next 10 days. Elena felt her chest tighten as she read the letter over and over. It didn't outright accuse her of wrongdoing, but it was clear she had been marked. The inspection wasn't just about her yard. It was about putting her on notice. She folded the letter carefully, placed it on her kitchen counter, and stared out the window at her garden. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. That evening, she overheard another conversation while walking her dog. 2 neighbors stood near the streetlight, their voices carrying in the quiet night. She's stubborn, isn't she? One said. She'll either comply or face the fines. HOA doesn't play around. Elena walked past without acknowledging them, but the words echoed in her head. For the first time since moving in, she felt unwelcome in a place she had hoped would be her forever home. The garden had become more than flowers now. It was a battleground. And though Elena didn't know it yet, the neighbors' whispers were only the beginning. The following Monday, Elena found a large envelope in her mailbox, stamped with the HOA's official seal. Unlike the vague inspection letter she had received earlier, this one carried a heavier tone. The heading read, Notice of Official Complaint, Violation of HOA Covenants. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the stapled pages. The document was filled with citations of rules, subsections, and clauses. One line stood out. The property located at her address has been found in violation of HOA standards regarding front yard maintenance and approved landscaping. A formal complaint has been filed by multiple residents. Elena sank into her porch chair, letter in hand. Until now, the whispers and notes had felt like background noise, something she could shrug off. But this was real. Someone had not only spoken against her, but had put it into writing. Worse, it wasn't just one person. The words multiple residents burned in her mind. She read the letter again, hoping she had misunderstood. It listed supposed violations: non-uniform plant structures, unauthorized use of yard space, obstruction of community view lines. Each bullet point felt like a personal attack, as though her flowers had somehow become weapons against the neighborhood. At the bottom of the page was a demand. She was required to attend the next HOA board hearing, where her case would be reviewed. Her garden, her sanctuary, was now on trial. That evening, Elena called her best friend from out of town, Megan. She read parts of the letter aloud over the phone. "They're treating it like you committed a crime," Megan said, her voice full of disbelief. "I don't even understand half of these rules," Elena admitted. "And it says I have to prove my garden isn't a violation. How do you even prove something like that?" "Sounds like they're bullying you," Megan replied. "Don't let them scare you." But despite her friend's encouragement, Elena couldn't shake the fear. She had never dealt with legal-sounding documents before, and the idea of sitting in front of a board of neighbors-turned-judges made her stomach twist. Over the next few days, the news spread quickly. Some neighbors casually mentioned, "Oh, I heard about the complaint. Rough spot to be in." Others weren't so subtle. One afternoon, while Elena was watering her sunflowers, a teenager biking past called out, "Better enjoy them while you can," before laughing and speeding away. It was clear now. Her garden had become the center of the community's gossip mill, and with the official complaint filed, those whispers carried more weight. Inside the HOA office, the complaint file was thickening. Mrs. Johnson and Mr. Sanders had each submitted detailed letters, complete with photos they had taken from across the street. One picture even circled Elena's bird feeder in red with the caption, "Attracting pests." Another board member added notes about long-term consequences of noncompliance, citing property value concerns. To them, this wasn't just about flowers. It was about control, precedent, and the message it would send to the rest of the community. The case was no longer a casual concern. It was an agenda item. The night before the hearing, Elena sat at her kitchen table, the complaint letter spread out before her. She tried to prepare, jotting down reasons why her garden wasn't harmful. It was clean, maintained, and even admired by visitors. But as she stared at her notes, doubt crept in. What if the board didn't care about her logic? What if the rules, no matter how unreasonable, gave them the upper hand? She glanced out the window at her roses, their petals glowing softly under the porch light. "I just wanted peace," she whispered. "Why does it feel like I'm preparing for war?" The community center parking lot was fuller than usual the night of the HOA hearing. Elena pulled in slowly, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than she realized. Through the windshield, she could already see clusters of neighbors gathered near the entrance, their voices carrying in the cool evening air. Some were curious. Others looked almost eager, like spectators arriving for a show. Elena had never been the center of attention in her life, and now the spotlight felt suffocating. Inside, the boardroom was arranged with a long table at the front, 5 HOA board members seated like a panel of judges. Folding chairs lined the rest of the room, filled with residents who had come to watch. Elena swallowed hard, clutching a folder of notes she had prepared. The chairperson, a middle-aged man named Mr. Whitaker, called the meeting to order. His voice was calm but formal, the kind of tone that carried authority. "Tonight," he announced, "we will be reviewing a formal complaint filed against a resident of 142, Maple Court regarding violations of landscaping regulations." All eyes turned toward Elena. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face flushing. Mrs. Johnson was the first to speak. She stood confidently, holding a stack of papers. "I've lived here for 20 years, and never have I seen a yard so blatantly against our standards. It's not just about flowers. It's about the principle. We have rules for a reason." She passed around photos she had printed, each one zooming in on Elena's garden. The bright sunflowers, the rose trellis, even the bird feeder, all displayed like evidence of a crime. When the chairperson finally gestured for her to respond, Elena felt her throat tighten. She glanced at her notes, but realized reading from them would make her sound robotic. So instead, she spoke from the heart. "My garden isn't a violation, it's my home. I keep it clean. I maintain it every day. It brings beauty to a neighborhood where most houses look exactly the same. I never thought flowers could be seen as a threat." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, but others frowned or crossed their arms. Mrs. Collins interjected sharply. "This isn't about beauty. It's about order. If one person decides they're above the rules, what stops the next person? We'll have chaos." Elena turned toward her. "I'm not above the rules. I'm just living quietly, minding my own space. If my garden offends you, maybe the problem isn't the flowers. A few gasps echoed in the room. The tension was palpable. The board members exchanged glances, scribbling notes as the back and forth continued. Finally, Mr. Whitaker raised his hand. We appreciate both perspectives. The board will review the complaint thoroughly before making a decision. For now, Ms. Elena, we ask that you refrain from expanding your garden further until this matter is resolved. The words felt like a leash being placed around her. She hadn't lost yet, but she hadn't won either. And the fact that so many of her neighbors had turned this into a spectacle cut deeper than she expected. When the hearing ended, Elena walked out into the parking lot, her chest heavy. A few neighbors avoided her gaze, while others whispered as she passed. But one older woman, Mrs. Hernandez, stopped her near the door. For what it's worth, she said softly, your garden makes me smile every morning. Don't let them take that from you. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. Elena managed a grateful smile before heading to her car. As she drove home, the streetlights flickering past her windows, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were only just beginning. The complaint had given her neighbors a weapon, and now she would have to decide whether to fight back or give in point 2 days after the hearing. Elena was back in her garden, trying to convince herself that everything would settle down. She clipped away dead leaves, watered the soil, and tried to drown out the unease building inside her chest. The board hadn't made its final decision yet. Maybe, just maybe, they'd let her keep her flowers. But as the sun dipped low in the evening sky, her peace was broken by a sharp, heavy knock on the front door. It wasn't the kind of knock neighbors used. It was loud, deliberate, like someone demanding entry. Elena froze, pruning shears still in her hand. Another knock followed, this one harder. HOA compliance, a voice boomed. Elena's heart raced. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked cautiously to the door. When she opened it, 2 men stood on her porch. They wore dark uniforms, not official police attire, but enough to look intimidating. Their shirts had patches stitched with HOA Security Division, words she had never seen before. Ma'am, one of them said in a stern voice, we're here to conduct an inspection. You've been cited for multiple violations. Elena blinked, caught off guard. I wasn't told about this. The board said they'd review before making any decisions. The taller of the 2 men stepped closer, his boots heavy against the wooden porch. We don't need to wait for the board. We've been authorized to enforce compliance. Either you let us inspect, or you'll be fined immediately. The way he spoke, the sharpness in his tone, made Elena's palms sweat. They weren't giving her a choice. She tried to stand firm. Do you have any paperwork? Any identification? The second man smirked. We don't need paperwork. We're the authority. Something about that answer felt wrong. Official, but not official enough. Still, their presence, their posture, their voices. It was designed to scare her into submission. Against her better judgment, Elena stepped aside, allowing them to walk into her yard. The 2 men strode across the grass, pointing at different parts of her garden, as though they were inspecting a crime scene. This trellis is unapproved, one declared. These sunflowers exceed height restrictions, the other added. And this bird feeder, clear violation, attracts pests. Each comment felt like a dagger. They weren't there to evaluate. They were there to condemn. Elena tried to defend herself. None of this is in the handbook. I checked. The taller man turned, his expression hard. The handbook doesn't cover everything. That's why we're here. To interpret the rules when residents like you try to bend them. Her stomach dropped. Interpret the rules? That wasn't law. That was tyranny. For a moment, Elena thought about shouting, about demanding they leave her property. But as she stood there, staring at their authoritative stance, she realized she was alone. No one would step in to help her. In fact, she noticed a pair of blinds across the street shift slightly, neighbors watching but not interfering. Her throat tightened. If she fought back now, they'd only twist her defiance into another accusation. So she stayed silent. The men scribbled notes on clipboards she hadn't noticed before. After a few minutes, the taller one approached her again. You'll be receiving a fine in the mail. And if you don't comply soon, further action will be taken. Elena forced herself to meet his eyes. What kind of action? The man smiled thinly, almost enjoying her fear. Removal of violations. With or without your permission. Her chest tightened. With or without my permission. The garden she had poured her heart into was being threatened outright. Without waiting for her response, the two men walked back toward their car, a black SUV with no official markings. They climbed in, slammed the doors, and drove off. Elena stood frozen on her porch, the air around her suddenly heavy and suffocating. For the first time, she realized this wasn't just about rules or neighbors disliking her flowers. This was intimidation, a deliberate attempt to break her spirit. She turned toward her garden, the evening light casting long shadows across the blossoms. The roses, the tulips, the sunflowers, all of them stood tall, oblivious of the threat that had just been delivered. But Elena wasn't oblivious anymore. She knew she was being targeted, and she knew the fight had only escalated as the SUV disappeared down the street. Elena remained standing on her porch, her arms wrapped around herself. The last traces of sunlight melted into darkness, leaving the garden in shadows. She whispered under her breath, as though to reassure herself, "They can't do this. They don't have the right." But the certainty in her voice faltered. The uniforms, the clipboards, the authoritative tone, all of it had been staged to strip her confidence. And in that moment, it had worked. She finally went inside, locking the door behind her. The silence of her home felt oppressive. She walked past the living room and into the kitchen, where she poured herself a glass of water with shaky hands. Her reflection in the window startled her. She looked pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. The next morning, Elena forced herself to step outside again. She wasn't going to let fear keep her indoors. She knelt in her garden, trimming a rose stem, but the feeling of eyes on her back made her uneasy. Sure enough, when she glanced up, she caught Mr. Green from across the street, watching her from his driveway. He quickly pretended to adjust his trash bins, but the smirk on his face gave him away. A few minutes later, Mrs. Johnson strolled by with her dog, deliberately slowing down as she passed Elena's yard. "Shame," she muttered loudly enough to be heard. "Rules are rules, dear. You should have known better." Elena's grip on the shears tightened, but she didn't respond. If she gave them the satisfaction of seeing her upset, they'd only push harder. By afternoon, another blow arrived. Elena checked her mailbox and found a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a typed notice. Notice of violation. You are hereby fined $500 for failure to comply with HOA landscaping standards. Failure to pay within 14 days will result in further enforcement measures. No letterhead. No signatures. Just words designed to scare. Her stomach churned. She had attended the hearing, followed the process, waited for the board's decision, and yet here it was, a punishment, slipped into her mailbox like a threat in disguise. She crumpled the paper in her fist. "This isn't legal," she muttered. But legal or not, it was happening. That evening, Mrs. Hernandez, the same neighbor who had quietly supported her after the hearing, knocked on Elena's door. She carried a small basket of homemade bread, her expression concerned. "I saw those men yesterday," she admitted softly. "Something about them didn't feel right. Did they give you any paperwork?" Elena shook her head and showed her the crumpled notice. Mrs. Hernandez frowned. "This isn't from the board. I've lived here long enough to know how they operate. This is intimidation." Her words were a balm to Elena's frayed nerves. Finally, someone else saw it for what it was. "But why me?" Elena asked, her voice breaking. "Why is my garden such a threat?" Mrs. Hernandez sighed. "Because you're different. Because you didn't fold when they expected you to. That makes you dangerous to people who thrive on control." That night, as Elena watered her garden under the glow of the porch light, she made herself a quiet promise. She wouldn't tear down her flowers. She wouldn't stop tending to them. She might not be ready to fight openly, not yet, but she would not surrender silently either. Every drop of water, every trimmed leaf, every petal she nurtured, it was her act of defiance. She glanced at the houses around her, blinds shifting, Shadows moving. Let them watch, she thought. Let them whisper. This garden wasn't going anywhere. Within a week of the HOA police visit, the neighborhood no longer felt like the calm, tree-lined street Elena had once moved into. It felt like a stage where every interaction carried subtext, every look carried judgment. Neighbors no longer waved casually while driving past. Instead, they either avoided eye contact altogether or held her gaze a little too long, as though daring her to break. Conversations didn't happen in the open anymore. They happened in clusters, whispered behind fences or murmured while walking dogs. The division had begun. Some residents, like Mrs. Hernandez, quietly offered words of encouragement. A younger couple down the street even stopped by one evening just to say, "We love your garden. Don't let them scare you." Their kindness felt like small beams of light in an otherwise darkening environment. But the other side was louder. The opponents, the Johnsons, the Greens, the Collins family, had found common ground in their dislike of Elena's one morning. Elena stepped outside to find a folded paper stuck in her mailbox, again without a proper stamp or sender. She unfolded it and froze. This neighborhood depends on order. Don't let one selfish resident ruin it for everyone. Below the message was a grainy photo of her garden, taken from across the street, with the words "violation" stamped in red letters across the image. Her stomach turned. By the afternoon, she discovered she wasn't the only one who had seen it. Copies of the flyer had been left in several mailboxes. Some residents had crumpled them up and tossed them aside. Others had pinned them on their refrigerators, treating them like public announcements. The divide was no longer silent. It was public defiance. And they weren't afraid to let others know the local coffee shop. Elena overheard two neighbors whispering when she walked in. She thinks just because she plants roses, she's above everyone else. Heard she cursed at the HOA police. That's why they're cracking down. The lies stung worse than the truth. She hadn't cursed. She hadn't broken rules. Yet the rumors painted her as reckless and disrespectful. By the time she reached the counter, even the barista gave her a sympathetic but awkward smile, as though she were a troublemaker everyone knew but no one wanted to confront directly. That weekend, a small but noticeable shift happened. A group of neighbors came over to admire her garden openly, clapping her on the back and saying things like, "Don't let them bully you, Elena." One even offered to help mow her lawn for free, just to show solidarity. But across the street, the opposition gathered on the Greens' driveway, arms folded, watching. Their presence was meant to counterbalance the support, an unspoken reminder that she wasn't universally welcome. The street felt like a battleground, with Elena's garden as a contested territory. Despite having supporters, Elena couldn't shake the heaviness of isolation. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying whispers and stares in her mind. She wondered how many people truly stood with her, and how many only pretended out of politeness. Even running errands became stressful. At the grocery store, she bumped into Mrs. Collins, who muttered, "Still playing the victim, I see." Her cheeks burned. She wanted to defend herself, to scream the truth, but the weight of constant scrutiny drained her energy. Sometimes silence felt safer, even though it left her feeling voiceless. The garden itself became a symbol. For Elena, it was beauty, peace, identity. For some neighbors, it became a symbol of rebellion, a reminder that rules could be bent. The street that once shared block parties and friendly waves now bristled with suspicion. And beneath it all, Elena sensed something worse brewing. The flyers, the whispers, the divide, it felt orchestrated. Someone wasn't just letting things spiral. Someone was pushing them, step by step, into chaos. She just didn't know who. Not why IT began with small acts. One morning, Elena discovered her trash bins had been tipped over, garbage spilling across her driveway. At first, she thought it was raccoons, but the way the lids had been neatly placed on the sidewalk made her suspicious. Another day, she found chalk writing on the curb outside her house. Follow the rules. The letters were big, bold, and unmistakably intentional. She cleaned it quickly, but the sting lingered. It wasn't vandalism on a large scale, but it was enough to remind her that someone wanted her to feel unwelcome every time she stepped outside. One Saturday afternoon, Elena was tending her roses when Mr. Green approached her driveway. His tone was smug, his arms crossed. "You know, you're tearing this neighborhood apart," he said. Elena looked up, wiping dirt from her hands. "I'm just taking care of my own garden." "You're making a spectacle," he shot back. "People used to get along here. Now it's all arguments, flyers, and drama. And it's because you refuse to follow the same rules as everyone else." Elena's voice trembled, though she tried to steady it. "What rule did I break, Mr. Green?" "Show me." Pointed out in the handbook. For a moment he faltered, but then leaned closer. "Doesn't matter if it's written down. The rules are about respect, and you clearly don't respect this community." With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving her gripping the fence post for balance. His words were designed not to clarify, but to wound BY now. The street had two clear camps. Supporters of Elena stopped by her yard more often, openly praising her flowers. Sometimes they left little notes of encouragement or even packets of seeds, as if planting solidarity alongside her defiance. Meanwhile, the opposition grew louder. Mrs. Johnson organized an informal yard compliance walk, where like-minded neighbors strolled the street and nitpicked at every property. When they reached Elena's house, they stopped longer, shaking their heads in exaggerated disapproval. The street, once filled with children's laughter and barbecue smoke, now hummed with tension. Block parties were canceled. Neighbors who once borrowed sugar from each other now crossed the street to avoid awkward encounters. Inside her home, the divide gnawed at Elena. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the weight of eyes on her. She couldn't water her plants without wondering who was snapping pictures. She couldn't take her trash out without wondering if it would be scattered again by morning. The stress began to seep into her daily routine. She skipped her morning coffee runs to avoid whispers at the cafe. She stopped answering calls from unknown numbers, afraid it would be another fake notice or threatening voice. At night, she lay awake replaying conversations, imagining worse scenarios. What if they escalated? What if one day she came home to find her garden destroyed?